It's definitely a new chapter in superpower relations. And if you thought last week's acrimony in Anchorage, Alaska, between top U.S. and Chinese officials could be dismissed as just a bit of theater for the cameras, well, think again. New U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken now in Brussels on the heels of concerted sanctions against top officials blamed for the crackdown on Uighur Muslims in China's western Xinjiang province. For the EU, it's the first sanctions against Beijing since the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. Is the bloc flexing its muscle more boldly, or simply happy to follow the lead of a U.S. administration that is re-engaging with its traditional allies? Either way, it's all heating up. We'll ask about retaliatory sanctions targeting China critics in Europe and the summoning of Beijing's ambassador to Paris. And while Blinken's in Brussels, the Russian foreign minister's in China, talking up the concept of an alternative to the U.S. dollar as the world's currency. And that's a reminder of just how much times have changed from the days when the Soviet Union barely did any business at all with the West. The interdependence today between China and its rivals are showing that they're also essential trading partners. And that perhaps adds a whole heap of uncertainty to this current spike in tension. Today in the France 24 debate, are we headed towards a new Cold War? Joining us, Jean-François Di Meglio, president of the Asia Center think tank. How are you?
Good evening.
Thanks for stopping in. We thank as well entrepreneur and commentator André Lezico-Pietri, president of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative, which stands for?
For JEDI, it's an initiative for breakthrough innovation to make Europe lead again in technologies.
All right, which is, after this pandemic year, something to behold. Independent journalist Bei Shan joins us from Montreal. Welcome to the France 24 debate.
Good evening, gentlemen. Seems to be the only lady, yeah?
It's great to have you. Welcome to the show. Oxford University historian with the long view, Rana Mitter, the author of China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. Thanks for joining us.
Great pleasure to be here this evening with you for the France 24 debate.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, coordination on sanctions unseen in a while. The US, EU, UK, also Canada, with strong pushback from China. Karis Garland has more.
Beijing stood firm and set a somewhat menacing tone on Tuesday, one day after the EU, US, Britain and Canada united to impose sanctions on China over alleged human rights abuses.
奉劝他们不要低估中国人民捍卫国家利益与民族尊严的坚定意志，来而不往非礼也。他们终将为他们的愚蠢和傲慢付出代价。
The sanctions include an asset freeze and travel bans against 4 senior officials in Xinjiang, the northwestern territory where exiles and human rights groups say more than 1 million Uyghur people have been forced into detention camps. China struck back with its own sanctions against 10 individuals and 4 EU entities, accusing them of spreading lies and disinformation.
Rather than change its policies and address our legitimate concerns, China has again turned a blind eye, and these measures are regrettable and unacceptable. We want China to engage in a dialogue with the EU human rights, not to continue being confrontational.
The penalties are the EU's first against China since the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. On Tuesday, Beijing said it had summoned the bloc's and the UK's ambassador to China to make a, quote, solemn protest against the sanctions. It denies allegations of human rights abuses and says training programs, work schemes and better education have helped stamp out extremism in the region.
André Lezico-Pietri, are you surprised that in the week since that first sit-down between the Biden administration and envoys of Xi Jinping, that the escalation has continued?
Well, not really, because when you look at really what happened in Anchorage, it was more a show of force in the respective camps. China wanted to show that it's not backing off even with the new Biden administration. And more importantly, because the inviting power was the US initially, it wanted to show its allies that it's standing strong, So it's allies in Asia, it's allies in Europe, and basically trying to show the way that even if it's new administration, we will not change our policy, be it on technology, be it on human rights. And, well, some people called it the Empire Strikes Back.
The Empire Strikes Back, and we saw those coordinated sanctions, Jean-François Di Maglio, which something we didn't see during the Trump administration. But I have to ask you about this. The EU, UK, and Canadian lists, it leaves wiggle room as well. It doesn't include, most notably, the powerful boss of Xinjiang's province's Communist Party, Shen Kuangguo, who was hit by U.S. sanctions last July.
Well, the first piece of news is that the U.S. administration plays it by multilateralism again. And that's the main message as compared to the Trump administration. Trump administration used to play it bilateral and never by multilateral, so that's the first piece of news. So you still have a gap to fill between what was happening during the Trump administration and what possibly will happen. But you do have a huge gap, which is called the CAI, the cross agreement on investments, which is something that EU signed with China on the 31st of December last year. So how would you reconcile that US position as it was defined and the fact that EU is still entangled with the commitment to have the CAI enforced, provided...
But is that CAI dead now?
No, it's not. It's not. It's neither.
Because it has to be ratified, and when you have sanctions against EU parliamentarians, what are the chances of it being ratified?
I would say Europe is half pregnant, if I may say. So I cannot say whether CAI is alive or whether it's dead.
Or maybe it's on life support.
Yeah, because CAI was indeed finalized late December last year, but it has to be ratified. And if you want to ratify it, you have to go to the EU Parliament. And we all know that EU Parliament, where, by the way, our representative Glucksmann is a member.
It's a French member of the European Parliament who's on this list of people under sanctions.
EU Parliament always opposed whichever position EU was taking vis-à-vis China when it was too positive. So you still have this gap. The CAI is around. EU is aligning its position with the US. But of course, you have 4 years or even more if you go back to 1989, where the positions were different. And of course, China is trying to divide us because China is divide and rule.
Rana Mitter, how much daylight is there between the positions on this side of the Atlantic and those in Washington?
I think on this particular set of sanctions and the reactions to them, there's very little daylight indeed. We don't yet know the exact details of how things were negotiated, but I'll refer you to a comment which Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, is reported as having made within the last few hours. We're all in it together. In other words, Canada, the UK, the EU, the US, 4 entities which until recently were thought of as really being not necessarily all that much on the same page. There are other issues that you've covered on France 24, such as the difference in vaccine provision in Europe. That's causing some friction. But what this seems to show is that compared to all of that, compared to this China question and the sanctions question, the European disunity is nothing compared to wanting to put up a united front against China. I should say that I think that many in Beijing might be surprised at quite how forceful the reaction has been from the Atlantic and European side and how much unity there has been in this. And we know that the 2 main ambassadors from the European side, the British ambassador Caroline Wilson and the EU ambassador Nicolas Chapuis, have been called in, I think, in the last few hours to see the foreign ministry in Beijing. But I think that because so many different aspects of Europe's relationship with China have been called into question, sanctions against parliamentarians, sanctions against a major think tank, sanctions against people who essentially comment rather than actually doing anything about China. This, I think, has set a lot of alarm bells flashing on both sides of the Atlantic, more perhaps than Beijing realizes.
Beishan, are you surprised at how the West has reacted over the last week?
I have to say yes and no first. But before I elaborate on this, I want to talk about Xinjiang, because basically all the Western people, like oh my goodness, my friends are asking, are the Xinjiang people are suffering everything? But to my personal experience, it's totally a different story, because I was born in China and I was raised up in China and I went to universities in China. We have Uyghur students from the minorities, but they have different treatment than the other students. For example, they have their specific canteens go to, and we can dying out there, but they can they are more flexible on doing what. But basically, they have a lot of priority that we basically ordinary students don't have. And if you want to have a look at the basic data, like the Xinjiang nowadays, there are more people getting educated, more people are getting a happier life. They are just getting out of poverty. So basically, I have to say we have to change angles to see different things.
But you do, Beishan, you do confirm that the evidence is there, that there are mass internment camps, that there's been displacing of a lot of people, crackdown, people who've been enslaved in some cases. That all that has been documented by human rights organizations.
I only see reports, but I didn't see the resources. I didn't see in person, I have to say that.
All right, and on the issue, all right, the disagreement on the panel on this point about Xinjiang and why it's such a sore spot here. But on the point of the West's reaction, then, if you don't think it's that bad, then what's it about in your view?
I cannot say it's bad or good. It's just different. We have to change angles to things, because I think basically Westerners have stereotyped eyes for the Chinese thing, because basically everyone is saying that, oh my goodness, China is doing something, they are bullying other countries. But for me personally, because I live in China and now I'm in Canada, I'm in the liberty country, but I can say in my point of view, I think it's basically just change angles to see different things. In China, I'm more more extreme. When you change angles and you are in Canada, you see different things. You see people how live and how people in Canada, they react. I would say, okay, it happens, but we have to change angles to see and to understand each other.
Jean-François Dimaglia?
Yeah, well, the Uyghur topic is, of course, one topic, but another topic which has to be associated with the European position is Hong Kong. Because you may argue that for the Uyghur, okay, you may say it's not true or it's an internal affair. For Hong Kong, it's totally different, because you have the 1984 agreement. And obviously, China is breaching the British-Chinese agreement. Lately, UK raised its voice. Well, it's still too low, but it's UK's role to say something about it. And once UK says something, hopefully, Europe will follow. Of course, it's not the role of continental Europe, mainland Europe, to speak first, because this is a British-Sino affair for the moment. But this has to be put on the same footing as what can be said about the Uyghur.
Britain has been raising its voice.
Yes, to a certain point, and very late, actually. There has to be some actions taken. The actions were on the BNO, on the overseas Chinese immigrating to UK. That's an action. But then you also have the business aspect of it. Hong Kong is a critical place for business. And of course, if it's a critical place, that's partly because of the agreement in 1984. What will happen to that? And won't China be hurt if those agreements are not followed 100%?
Rana Mitter, do you agree with Jean-François Dimaglia?
Well, I think what's very interesting about the way in which the Hong Kong issue is being treated by both China and by the outside world is that both sides are making different parts of a particular case. So on the one hand, there is an argument which I think is probably not going to go very far, that even after the handover of sovereignty in 1997 from the British back to the Chinese, that the outside world has sovereign rights to be able to change what goes on in Hong Kong. And legally speaking, that isn't the case. But it is the case that under the basic law, which was agreed under that 1984 joint declaration, certain guarantees have been made by China, including, quotes, a high degree of autonomy. And the real question that's coming up now is, do the electoral changes in Hong Kong, do the maintenance of foreign judges, for instance, on the Court of Final Appeal, does the maintenance of free media, which is constrained now but still does exist in some parts, more English language than Chinese, but nonetheless in Hong Kong, will that remain? I think realistically, the question now is not whether Hong Kong remains as free as it was. It's not as free as it was. But the question is whether it becomes somewhere like Singapore, in other words, with certain freedoms but restrictions, or whether it actually turns into a city like Shanghai or Chongqing in the mainland of China, where essentially freedom of the press and freedom of the judiciary are wholly subsidiary to the party. What I think is problematic from the Chinese point of view in claiming that the British, in opening up rights of residence to holders of British BNO passports, are interfering with Chinese domestic law, is that logically it doesn't really make sense. If you think about it, no country can tell any other country what kind of immigration laws to have about its own borders. So in the same way that if China decided that tomorrow morning it would allow all British people to come to China and settle there for free, well, Britain, I don't think it would complain about that, but it couldn't complain about it because that's to do with China's laws. And in the same way, if Britain wants to welcome large numbers of Hong Kong BNO passport holders, it's not for China to tell Britain what to do with its immigration laws. So I think we have to keep these issues quite separate and understand them in their own terms.
30 seconds before we go to the break. Beishan, your reaction?
I don't really have a lot of comments on this because I'm not at the standing point to answer this. But basically, again, I have to say we have to change our mindset of Westerners to see things. Again, we Orientals do things differently, okay?
All right, well, we're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we've been watching the escalation between the West and China, asking if it is something akin to a new Cold War that may be brewing. We're talking about it with Jean-François Di Meglio, president of the Asia Center think tank, entrepreneur and commentator André Lozeku-Pietri, president of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative. Independent journalist Beishan is with us from Montreal, and from Oxford, historian Rana Mitter, the author of China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. The tone has gotten harsher, sanctions, retaliation, and coincidence of the calendar. It's all happening when we've seen over the last week the trial of two Canadians accused of spying. This was right after a top exec was detained in Vancouver, a top exec from Huawei, for this was late 2018 on a U.S. extradition request. Western diplomats barred from the trials of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and the Chinese saying that it is because of there may be state security issues inside of the testimony. Now, there's also an issue with diplomats here. We've seen this Tuesday ambassadors summoned in Germany, in France and other places. China's outspoken ambassador to France summoned to the foreign ministry over harsh rhetoric targeting an academic and those sanctions we've been talking about, retaliatory sanctions that include a French member of the European Parliament. Yuka Royer has more.
Insults are common in Twitter space, but when they come from a foreign embassy's official account, they take on a different dimension. Little thug and crazed hyena are some of the recent comments by the Chinese embassy in Paris, directed at Antoine Bondas, a China specialist who has frequently taken up the issue of Taiwan. This, in addition to a series of threats aimed at French lawmakers to discourage them from visiting the island. The language proved unacceptable for the French government, prompting the foreign minister to summon the Chinese ambassador to the country, Liu Shai.
There is no place in Franco-Chinese relations for insults and attempts at intimidation against elected officials and researchers.
It's the second time Shire is reprimanded by his host country. Last April, as the embassy waged a PR campaign to praise Beijing's success in handling the coronavirus pandemic, he accused workers in French retirement homes of abandoning their jobs and leaving their residents to die of hunger and disease. Speaking to France 24 a few weeks later, he assumed a much more diplomatic tone.
European governments weren't serious enough, in your opinion?
That's not what I wanted to say. What I mean is that the Chinese government attaches a lot of importance to the fight against this virus.
The recent Twitter attacks are the latest example of increasing displays of ultranationalism by Chinese diplomats. Its embassy in London has also been embroiled in a row over free speech and Hong Kong. Chauvinism taking centre stage. Beijing is now using diplomacy to show its might, in addition to its traditional military exercises and activity in disputed territories.
Andrei Lizakuk-Pietri, what's the deal with Ambassador Liu?
Well, I think the deal, what we're seeing unfolding is that basically all sides now have a very different logic. That's the only thing I would agree with what our colleague from Canada said, is that we always thought that the rationale would make people and parties continue to talk. What we are seeing is that on one side, the US is probably really cutting off all kind of ties it can have. You can see even on things like semiconductor strategies to ban Chinese from having access to US technologies. And you see in China probably a rhetoric which is more inward looking. That means almost free speech now for its diplomats, who used to have only a couple of years ago the most soft tone that you can imagine. And the Europeans are suddenly waking up.
So when Ambassador Liu is making those harsh statements, attacking an academic as being a thug and this kind of thing, it's for a domestic audience, is what you're saying?
Well, there is even some hypothesis, which I don't know how much this is true or not, that he is himself aiming for a higher post because he's vice minister in the ranking in China. So he may be even aiming for a higher post 2022 when there will be potentially a reshuffle. So there is maybe something out of it. And today it pays off because this is the official line, is not backing off. And the fact that China reacted in less than 24 hours to what happened in Europe is also telling this is totally unusual. I mean, this tit for tat is completely away from the traditional Chinese way, which was always the subdued tone and not raising fear.
Actually,
and I think the consequence it will have, I think the big gorilla that we have not seen yet is what will be the reaction of Germany. Because as Jean-François very correctly said, it was Germany who really pushed in a last effort, on the last day of its European semester last year, the investment treaty. How will Germany react? And especially you mentioned that there was a French parliamentarian in the European Parliament, but there's also probably an even higher heavyweight, which is called Reinhard Bütikofer, who is also on the list of 10. And he's from the Greens. So imagine, if we have a new political constellation in Germany in a couple of months, that will be a very, very interesting reset of the whole relationships.
Are you surprised, Jean-François Dimagui, about the tone from Beijing's diplomats?
Well, I must say my age allows me to remember what China was before 79. You know, I arrived to China the first time in 79 when the reform just started. It reminds us of not only a China of the past, but another Marxist country which used to address its interlocutors in very harsh terms, and that was USSR. You know, if we look at diplomatic relations, I was just thinking about this term of, you know, Cold War, hot peace. If you really want a war, you don't really address your interlocutor with such harsh terms. I'm afraid to remember what German diplomacy used to be in the 30s. Von Ribbentrop was a very urban diplomat. The ones who were not urban diplomats were the ones who were running the Cold War, the USSR. I wouldn't say that...
So the bark is worse than the bite?
Well, possibly, but most importantly, it refers not to Chinese tradition, because China is big. And what I usually say, China is bigger than China. And the Chinese tradition is longer than Communist Party. So China is not like this. But Marxism is like this. And the more China speaks like this, the more communist and the more Marxist it sounds, because it reminds us of what USSR was speaking, the way it was speaking.
So let's turn to the historian in the room here. Rana Mitter, is this a Cold War?
I don't think it is a Cold War in the classic sense, because actually both China, the United States and the Western world are far too involved with each other to have the kind of real separation that you had in the Cold War, where economic systems didn't combine and where political systems were almost wholly opposed without any kind of interaction. But I think one of the other reasons actually comes from some of the more interesting statistics that lie under the surface of this language. And first of all, just to say, it is worth noting there are Chinese diplomats, very skilled Chinese diplomats, like Ambassador to the United States, Cui Tiankai, like Vice Foreign Minister Madame Fu Ying, who actually speak in much more measured tones even now and seem sometimes explicitly to say that this kind of very aggressive diplomacy isn't necessarily doing China a great deal of good in the world. So it's worth noting that even China's own representatives sometimes speak in different voices. But let me just give you one statistic, which is very, very significant for the fact that we're on France 24. Recently, opinion polling by a Western company, Ipsos Mori, that was allowed to operate inside China, found that France currently had an 81% favorable rating amongst the Chinese middle class people who were surveyed. The United Kingdom also actually had a very high rating in the high 80s, but France, you'll be pleased to hear, came top. What does this mean? It means that lots of ordinary middle-class Chinese people like our friend Beishan here, who I'm sure is going to have something to say, of course are nationalistic, of course they feel proud of their country. Sometimes some of them use this pretty intemperate language. But at the same time, they also recognize a lot that is good about the West. They're still interested in living there, in being educated there, in doing business there. And I have to say, the one thing that would likely cause a real riot in the street in China is not about democracy. It will be about if the government ever forbade the Chinese middle classes from sending their kids to be educated in America, in Canada, in Australia, in France, in Germany, and in Britain. So the attitudes towards the West, of course, have a lot of this very fierce rhetoric. But when you look at the statistics about what people really think, where they put their money, where they put their children, the story turns a little bit different.
Yeah, but are we perhaps at a turning point now?
Well, I think that a lot of this language is turning in some very different directions. And I mentioned before, Germany's been mentioned. The fact that one of the sanctions, targets for sanctions, is Merix, a very well-respected think tank based in Berlin that writes on China. It doesn't have any interference within China itself. It just writes reports. That's a very bad sign, because that suggests that then basically what the Chinese write about the West and what the West write about China can be the subject of objection by other government. And free speech and free exchange of views on both sides mean that that can't be accepted. Our friend Beishan, I'm sure, would want to be free in Canada or France or Britain to say exactly what she thinks about the West, even when she's going to have to tell us things we don't want to hear. That's fine. But it also means that on the Western side, we have to be able to free to tell our friends in China sometimes when we think they're getting it wrong, and they're very free to disagree. If we don't have that point of agreement, then yes, that will be an important turning point, because it means that a civilized dialogue in which both sides agree that sometimes we will disagree and we will call each other out for doing what we think is wrong is no longer possible. That would be a very dangerous turning point. I hope we're not at that point, and that we step back from these sanctions against individuals and in particular against think tankers.
Beishan, can it be rolled back, all the rising rhetoric here?
Thank you. Nice comments, Professor. I think I appreciate your humor. Basically, I think Mr. Lu is doing what he's supposed to do, because that's his job, to defend his own country. So I have no position on that, because basically I think he's doing the right job. But look at that, because just imagine if you have a diplomatic issue, and there's a diplomat coming over and to defend his own country, that's very justified, no? And also, I think basically it's because we have a stereotype stereotyped image of the diplomat that in our mind, so that we think he's different, so we are not accepting it because he's different. So it's not because that he's different that we are not accepting, it's because it's not a stereotype that we realized.
Well, His Excellency Liu might be doing what he should do, but in that case, he should also go to the summoning by our foreign minister. He didn't go. So far, yes, he probably complied with the Jianlang policy, the warring diplomats, the warring wolves, the wolf warriors from the famous movie, which was a hit in the Chinese theaters. So he's a wolf warrior in a sense. So yes, he's doing what he's asked to do. But our Ministry of Foreign Affairs is also doing what he's supposed to do. Unfortunately, His Excellency Liu did not go because he had something better to do. And that's very surprising. You never say that, and you never do that in any practical diplomacy. So we are just out of the traditional diplomatic game. That's what Mr. Liu has to say.
Beishan?
I am out.
Beishan, should he have gone to that summoning?
Basically, I think, again, we have stereotype on everything. That's very noble. It's spontaneous, and naturally we come out with this, oh, this is different. Oh, this is Chinese. Oh, this is this and that. We have a stereotype on everything. Okay, Mr. Liu, I basically think he's doing his job, but he's just a little bit different from other traditional diplomats. So, but he is still doing his job. He's defending his own country. He's defending on his people, his country. So basically, I think he's doing his good job. Yeah.
All right. At the outset of this conversation, we were wondering aloud, again, if we're at a turning point right now, and whether the ill wind that we're talking about could scuttle those plans for new investment, new trade agreements, points mentioned by our panelists.
Investment agreement. I'm sorry to
investment.
To correct.
No, you're right to correct.
It's very important.
Thank you, Jean-François. And while we've seen that, we heard the U.S. administration say that beyond the rhetoric, they did speak. There are back channels when it comes to the rules of the game on things like artificial intelligence, for instance. The tension continues to rise. There's been a lot of talk here about supply chains during the COVID pandemic and overdependence on China. And then there's the rules of the game when you work there. While Apple is bracing for new constraints from Beijing when it comes when it unveils new settings to its secure privacy, users' privacy. Here you're seeing Tesla CEO Elon Musk addressing a Beijing-backed business forum last weekend. Musk insisting his electric vehicles will never spy on his hosts. This after the Chinese government's decision to restrict the use of Tesla cars by military personnel or key employees of state-owned companies. Here's what Musk said. Whether it's Chinese or U.S., the negative effects, if a commercial company did engage in spying, the negative effects of that company would be extremely bad. So the outspoken Elon Musk going cap in hand here, saying, no, we can still do business. Your thoughts on whether or not Elon Musk will continue to be able to do business in China?
Elon Musk has this stature that Jack Ma, the CEO of Alibaba, used to have, and considered as intouchable. That means he's doing his business that is beyond any kind of barrier. And we could see that somebody that was supposed to be completely untouchable, like Jack Ma, was in just a couple of weeks, because of some comments that irritated a lot of government officials, was almost wiped off the surface of Chinese business. And Ant Financial did not go public, and Alibaba now is really reined in and much more integrated into the system. And just that happened in 3 months. So I think what we're seeing with Elon Musk is he's a free rider anyway, and that's why a lot of people, me included, admire him for that. But what we are seeing in practical terms is that a lot of large corporations are just watching very closely what is going on. And you begin to see in a lot of multinationals, China for China supply chains, US for US, Europe for Europe. And not just because of the tension. And then it's also because of the pandemic. We saw that the distortion in supply chains was so huge last year that now people are reacting. So the decoupling is really happening under our eyes.
And then if that decoupling happens, Rana Mitter, are we then back to what it was like during the Cold War, where the US and the Soviet Union, or the West and the Soviet Union, barely did any business at all? Are we headed that way with all this talk of changing supply chains?
I think it'll take a very long time and more effort and money than actually people will manage to be able to do that quickly. The problem is that a large part of the supply chains on both sides, the Chinese side as well as the Western side, are really very heavily entangled with each other. So if you think about big Western 5G providers, Nokia and Ericsson, they have large interests in China, which would be hard to withdraw. And yet China, of course, is still immensely dependent on semiconductor chips, despite attempts under the new 5-year plan to create domestic semiconductor production. Actually, most Chinese chip makers think that that really isn't going to be possible very quickly. So I think, unfortunately, both sides are doomed to live with each other for much longer than they want to acknowledge. I think that this kind of war of rhetoric that's going on at the moment is going to go on for quite a while. And because it's going to be more important, essentially, for Chinese leaders looking to get to the top to show that they're tough against the outside world, I think we can see a lot more of this kind of language appearing. But I think in practice, we also need to look to the next generation, younger Chinese who have more international exposure, who understand more than I think the current leading generation in China do about how the outside world works, about nuance, about rhetoric, and those things may change after a while. Particularly, of course, one last factor that we have to bear in mind, from 10 years' time, China is going to get very much older, very much more quickly. China's demographics are changing because of the remnants of the one-child policy, family policy. And that means that areas such as pharmaceuticals, areas such as healthcare for the elderly are going to become much more of a concern now. So the language of the warriors of the 2020s may turn into the language of the bath chairs and the wheelchairs of the 2030s and 2040s when it comes to China.
Jean-François Di Meglio, the current leadership, they understand the West. I mean, Xi Jinping himself did some of his studies in the US, didn't he?
Well, not Xi Jinping. No, the term of mindset was used. And I think this is very important. Definitely, there is not enough knowledge in the West about how China thinks. China still thinks about what it used to be before, that century where it was colonized, and the West does not totally understand what is in Chinese mind. Conversely, Chinese minds are obsessed by this century, and there is a lot of misunderstanding. That's absolutely true. And this is why the best way of understanding what Chinese people think is just to go and read what they write and understand in their language what they do. Because if you don't go to the source, then you don't understand. You have to borrow their mindset. That doesn't mean that you should embrace it and that you should agree, but I think you have to understand. Just one thing about, if I may, about Cold War. I prefer the terms of hot peace because, the West and the East are entangled. China has invested, and thanks to André, particularly, China has invested into the West. You do have Chinese investment into the West. You cannot just withdraw them unless you lose money. And the same applies to the West investing into China. That was not the case during the Cold War. That was not the case before World War II.
Beishan, we're out of time, but do you think that the understanding between China and the West, as described there by Jean-François, it's set to increase or decrease?
Let me give you an example. Just imagine that this monsieur said, I am a nationalist. Okay, so because I have this kind of simple speech, so you have a conclusion. That's the way that the Western looking at China. That's the only angle you're looking at that, because it's people just so easy to get judgmental, okay? So, but it's not the way that we look at things. That's why I said I have to keep saying that we have to change mindset. We have to look in a different pictures. We have to see the different aspects.
All right, but we'll have to leave it there for now. Beishan, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Montreal. I want to thank Rana Mitter from Oxford, Jean-François Di Meglio, André Lezecoq-Pietri. Much more to talk about. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.